to Jewish immigrant parents in 1932. And that was a very bad year in the Great Depression. The family had very limited means, but they had values of intellect that were very important to them. They moved to the Bronx when he was an infant. Mel was always very curious, and when he was in the early years in elementary school, he was fascinated by science. He had a science kit for kids and tried experiments. One time, when he was about 10 years old, he learned about electricity and magnets. He decided to magnetize some scissors by inserting them into an electrical outlet in the family's apartment. The experiment failed and managed to short circuit an entire apartment building. It did not, however, discourage him, because in 1972, quite a few years later, his book, The Principles of Electrodynamics, was published and was an innovative approach to teaching that subject. It was his favorite subject to teach. New York City had several public high schools established by Fiorello LaGuardia in the late 1930s. One such school was the Bronx High School of Science. Entrance to the school was by academic record and a written exam. Mel was very fortunate to have been accepted to that school. At the present time, Bronx Science has had 7 Nobel Prize winning graduates. His goal at that time was to become an engineer. However, the 1940s was a spectacular time in experimental physics. Many of the great European physicists had escaped to the United States during World War II and contributed much to the US war effort and to academia. Enrico Fermi and his group split the atom, and Mel began to rethink his goal. By the time he graduated from high school, he was sure he wanted to be in physics. Mel was the recipient of a New York State scholarship. This would pay for tuition to any school in the state, but no books. He applied to Columbia, Harvard, and Yale, and he chose Columbia, realizing that he could live at home and manage within his limited finances. The Columbia Physics Department at that time was in the olden age of 20th century physics. It was built mainly by a great personality and physicist, I.I. Rabi. James Rainwater, Charles Towns, and T.D. Lee, Nobel Prize winners, were on the faculty. And this was an ideal environment for Mel. I met Mel at this time. I was 15 and he was 16. And we both belonged to a youth group in New York City. And I knew him as part of that social group. I was very impressed with him because when we had meetings on Sundays, he would do the New York Times double cross-stick in ink. You never know what will appeal to a prospective girlfriend. We didn't date until I graduated from high school years later. At Columbia, Mel took a course given by a young professor named Jack Steinberger. He was an inspiration for Mel, and when he became a graduate student, he chose Jack for his thesis advisor. He and Jack became lifelong friends and collaborators. During his first year in graduate school, Mel and I married. I was a junior at New York City's CCNY, and on weekends I would accompany Mel to the site of his experiment. Until then, my impression of scientists and experiments was of men in white coats, microscopes, test tubes, and Bunsen burners. I needed a reality check when it came to experimental physics. Everyone wore jeans and t-shirts. There were empty soda bottles and paper cups here and there. Instead of test tubes, there were flashing lights, dials, and cables. There was also a folding cot, some chairs, to accommodate for the long hours people spent monitoring the equipment. Mel claimed that a good experimentalist had to be a good plumber and electrician as well. After finishing his graduate work, Mel took a postdoctoral position at Brookhaven National Lab on Long Island. At that time, Brookhaven was managed by Associated Universities, which was a group that included Yale, Columbia, Princeton, and Johns Hopkins. He continued to work with Jack Steinberger and commuted to Columbia to teach. Jack gave Mel more and more responsibility, and in a few years, Mel was offered a position in the Columbia Physics Department. This was an exciting time in physics, mainly due to the interactions between scientists who were working at Brookhaven and Columbia. The Brookhaven cafeteria had pads of paper and pencils on every table. People were always exchanging ideas, arguing and joking as well. It was the perfect environment for Mel. We eventually moved closer to New York City and continued to commute between Brookhaven and Columbia. The Columbia Physics Department had two traditions that Mel valued and enjoyed. One was the once-a-week Chinese lunch presided over by T.D. Lee at a local restaurant, which brought together graduate students and professors. The other was a Thursday afternoon coffee hour, where again there was an exchange of ideas and the development of cohesiveness in the department. At that time, Mel would come to Columbia only on the days he would teach. This did not include Thursdays, but this particular week he decided to come to the Thursday coffee hour. He could never remember why he went to Columbia that day, still a mystery. The main discussion was the theory that there was more than one neutrino. If that could be proven, that would open neutrino physics to a whole new field of experiments. T.D. Lee had discussed the theory and had been able to construct the experiment. The theory that if they could construct the experiment, it would be very important. Fred Reines had discovered the first neutrino previously. I remember the excitement when Mel arrived home that evening. He was so agitated by the challenge of the theory, he skipped dinner and paced around our apartment. He kept saying, "I know it can be done." All of the reports of the grapefruit cannot describe what I experienced with him that night in the late 1950s. He published a one-page paper in the Physical Review early in 1960. The team was organized for the experiment, which was to be done in Brookhaven. Mel invited Jack Steinberger, who was then at CERN in Geneva, where his attempts to get the experiment started was canceled. Leon Lenneman, who was a professor at Columbia, joined the team as a third principal scientist. There were 3 graduate students and 2 regular Brookhaven employees. The group consisted of 7 people. Compare that to the number of experimenters in the 3 groups at CERN searching for the Higgs boson. The neutrino experiment demonstrates the very best of a time and style in physics that belonged to the 20th century. The importance of the neutrino experiment was hailed immediately as a major breakthrough. Mel was invited to give talks about the work. Many of his colleagues believed that the trio of Steinberger, Schwartz, and Lenneman would win the Nobel Prize. In 1962, when the experiment was completed, a close physics friend came and spent the night with us, certain that the announcement from Sweden would come in the early hours of the morning. It didn't happen, and it didn't happen for 26 years. Mel continued to work at Columbia, teaching and doing experiments in Brookhaven. He had very strong views about teaching. He would only teach undergraduate courses and grade exam papers himself. He believed in partial credit for the answers that were partially correct. His favorite course was Physics for Poets, a course he taught for students who had no physics background. He continued to mentor graduate students who worked with him at Brookhaven. From 1962 to 1966, Mel continued in his position at Columbia. In the interim, he received an offer from UC Berkeley's then director, Louis Alvarez, a brilliant physicist, inventor, and very much a Renaissance man. The offer was for less money than he was getting at Columbia. Mel turned down the offer. Alvarez said that the offer was according to an age salary scale. Mel was barely 30. The offer was inappropriate. In later years, Mel and Louis became very good friends. In 1965, Mel received an offer from Stanford University. Stanford physics was at the cusp of a new era in accelerator development. They had just completed the Stanford Linear Accelerator, which we call SLAC, and this was a very attractive opportunity for Mel. He would consider if he could have a position in SLAC and at the Stanford Physics Department. I was very reluctant to leave the East Coast. As a native New Yorker, I was considering a move from the suburbs into Manhattan. California was too far away, and I needed convincing. We spent the summer of 1965 as guests of the physics department and were given a lovely house in Old Palo Alto. It was my first exposure to the West. I could not believe the physical beauty of the area and the wonderful climate. However, it was not the city. I was very skeptical. One of Mel's friends invited us to his home north of San Francisco. We drove through San Francisco and I began to feel a bit differently. An urban environment with a great climate, a lovely bay with a bridge that was one of the symbols of the West Coast. We wrote a letter of resignation to Columbia so that I couldn't change my mind. I spent one more academic year at Columbia, and then we moved west in the summer of 1966. Mel commuted to Stanford during the ensuing years. He did experiments at SLAC and taught undergraduates at the university. Every year at Nobel Prize time, we would wonder, is this it? Colleagues in the physics world would wonder as well why the work was not recognized by a Nobel Prize. Physics had begun to change in the late 1970s. Mel had great difficulty getting his proposals accepted because, unlike in previous years, projects at SLAC had to be approved by a committee, which included members of the Department of Energy and others who were not necessarily experimentalists. His proposals were very innovative, and the committee was always asking what his results would be. Of course, he couldn't say, because that was why he was proposing his projects. Mel believed in taking chances, which he combined with a keen intuition. After much frustration with committees which he felt he could not understand physics, he decided to try something else. Some of his proposed experiments were later done by others. While teaching at Stanford, he started a company called Digital Pathways with a partner, Len Bergwood, who was an engineer at SLAC. Mel said that maybe someday he would have enough money to fund his own experiments. His company was one of the first to address computer security. When Mel made the decision to build the company, he told me, businessmen don't get a Nobel Prize, and he was becoming a businessman. He continued to build Digital Pathways. One day in 1988, a man came to the office of Digital Pathways and said that his company was considering a possible security contract and wanted to know who the main contacts would be and if the president of the company was Melvin Schwartz, the physicist. The receptionist later recalled that the man had a foreign accent. That man was a member of the physics committee of the Swedish Academy for the Nobel Prize. On the morning of October 19th, the phone rang. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. I panicked. I was sure it was some family catastrophe. It was a member of the Nobel Committee. At first he asked, is this Melvin Schwartz of Stanford University and Digital Pathways? Within a half hour, the press was at our front door. Instant celebrity. We were in a state of shock. I phoned a close friend of mine and said, "Shirley, Nell just won the Nobel Prize." And she said, "Sure," and hung up. She just didn't believe it. After all those years, it really became almost unbelievable. The employees at Digital Pathways had no knowledge of Nell's history. I must say that the reason that they are so careful about ascertaining who the person is that there's a story that at one time, for the prize in chemistry, they called up the person and they said, "You have won the Nobel Prize in chemistry." And he said, "No, that's not possible." And they said, "Yes, yes, believe it." He said, "No, I'm a pharmacist. I'm not a chemist." And so they've made mistakes before. On December 10th, 1988, Nell received the Nobel Prize with Jack Steinberger and Leon Letterman in Stockholm, along with the other prize recipients in chemistry, medicine, economics, and literature. The prize for economics is given by the bank rather than the Nobel Foundation. It's a week-long celebration consisting of visits to universities all over Sweden, a reception at appropriate embassies, and great entertainment at dinners attended by the King and Queen of Sweden. The award ceremony is on December 10th, the anniversary of Alfred Nobel's death. The King presents the Nobel medallion and a hand-painted document at this very formal ceremony. In 1991, Mel returned to the physics department at Columbia and was appointed director of physics at Brookhaven. His health had begun to fail, and we began to plan for our retirement. This brought us to our favorite place to ski, Sun Valley. We bought a condo, and on full retirement, bought the house that I continue to live in. Thank you.
We'll try and handle this. So let's take a few minutes if you guys have any questions. I have a question. Just they need a minute. There's always questions. Chelsea.
How was it to be married to someone who had such a demanding job or such an involved job?
Well, you know, I really believed in him. I really believed in the importance of what he did. And I admired his, he was very unassuming. This was somebody who I think was rather shy, but he knew his subject very well. And that was, I was willing to hook my wagon to that star. I really was.
Can you talk about his devotion to undergraduates, his great interest in?
Yes. Well, first of all, it was really interesting living within a group of graduate students. He encouraged the people that he thought had the talent. I think 2 or 3 of his graduate students are faculty members at several universities. But he also advised people not to go on to experimental physics and advised them to go on to related things in which they were successful. So, in fact, one of those people has established a Mel Schwartz Award at Bronx Science. His name.
I know you mentioned how much he loved teaching physics for poets. Just curious, in terms of, was he kind of single-mindedly devoted to physics, or was he a generalist in the sense of curiosity about many subjects?
Well, he had a lot of, first of all, Columbia fosters that. And he was an undergraduate at Columbia, and a graduate student, and a faculty member. So he went through their whole program. But he had a lot of interests. I mean, we hiked and skied, that's one thing, but he also loved woodworking and had a whole workshop that he set up, and he was an avid photographer. So I think that helped him a lot when he retired. almost unreal. You know, I felt as though I was in some storybook, because the king and queen really do look like a king and queen. and everybody bows to royalty, and they say, Americans don't bow, we shake hands. And I was very impressed with that. I thought that was really very, very special. And then at one point, I received a note that said I would be sitting next to the king.